Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books and Process series. A joint project of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, US chapter, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the POP Conference. I'm Elena Razlogova, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisberg, Carl Wilson, Gus Stadler, Alyx Vesey, and Antonia Randolph. You can find our entire calendar on the ASPM website under the Journal tab. You can also catch up on videos of all our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including a session from 2 weeks ago with Francis Bradley and Gabrielle Van Landinam Dunn on the Great Migration and Creativity in Jazz. We will be off next week. We will return on April 1st with books on albums and singles with Michael Bartel, Maya Smith, and Jason Schneider. Today, Liz Pelly, Andrew deWaard, and Brian Fauteux discuss their books on aspects of the streaming music industries and the ways that platforms, media companies, and banking have shaped and altered music culture in the 21st century. Let me give you some quick background on today's presenters. Liz Pelly is a writer and editor based in New York. She is the author of Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify, and The Costs of the Perfect Playlist, which you probably have read either the book or reviews by now. Her byline has appeared at The Baffler, Guardian, Harper's, NPR, Pioneer Works Broadcast, and many other outlets. She's an adjunct instructor at NYU Tisch School. Andrew deWaard is an assistant professor of media and popular culture in the Department of Communication at the University of California in San Diego. He's the author of Derivative Media, How Wall Street Devours Culture, that just came out in 2024, and the co-author of the Cinema of Steven Soderbergh from Columbia University Press. He's a co-founder of the Cultural Capital Project, which studies working musicians in the streaming age, and the Media Consolidation Research Organization, which analyzes the effects of monopoly ownership on media. Brian Fauteux is an associate professor of popular music and media studies. He studies music industries and music radio, often from the interrelated perspectives of cultural studies, history, and policy, and is currently a co-investigator on a research project that investigates public infrastructure in the digital music industries. He's the author of Music in Range, The Culture of Canadian Campus Radio, and Music in Orbit, Satellite Radio in the Streaming Space Age, which just came out and will be discussed. During their conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat. In the last part of the session, Alex will call on you to unmute and ask them during the Q&A. And of course, we'll also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation at any time. However, we'll ask the presenters to ignore the chat during their discussion, and we'll send them a copy of the chat transcript later, so they won't miss anything. And now I'm going to turn things over to our presenters. Take it away.
Should we go in that order? Liz, do you want to start, or should we go from the bottom up? I can start.
Oh, I'm happy to go first if that makes sense. I actually do have slides also.
I will make you co-host.
Yeah.
Try it.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Perfect.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Well, I will set a timer for 8 minutes and try very hard to not go over that. Okay, cool. Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you to Alex and Brian and Andrew for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you both about your amazing books. As was just explained in the introduction, I'm most recently the author of this book, Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist, which builds on some journalistic work done over the past few years around Spotify and the impacts on listeners and musicians. My background is in journalism, and when I first started working on my first article about Spotify. The year was 2016, and it was a time when there was a lot of conversation happening about the streaming royalty model and the impacts of streaming on musicians, but there was less discussion, at least in the world of journalism, happening about the impacts of streaming on listeners. So I started looking at the Spotify interface or homepage, the literal entryway into the app, as an entryway into the story. And when I started looking at the homepage, I got sort of, fixated on the idea of Spotify playlists, or what potential backdoors into Spotify playlists major labels were able to access to influence what the average user saw when they opened this app. So that's what this first piece was. I interviewed anonymous digital marketing employees from major labels, and the questions were pretty straightforward. What are we looking at when we open Spotify? How did it get there? On whose dime? Who owns visual real estate? Who shapes the editorial voice? And it's a bit striking to look back on, because in some ways the book that I just published, to me sometimes feels like a 90,000 word answer to these same questions that I was asking when I wrote this first article in 2017. But in order to sort of tell a bigger story in this book, one of the threads running through it is that I try to trace the concept of the Spotify playlist as a cultural phenomenon. And that requires, going back to 2013, when Spotify first launched its in-house playlisting ecosystem. Spotify launched in 2008 in Europe, in 2011 in the United States, but it wasn't until 2013 that the concept of the official Spotify playlist as a cultural phenomenon really emerged. For the product's first 5 years of existence, it operated more like a search bar, with curation provided by third-party playlisters and individual users. Daniel Ek himself was thought to be really opposed to an overly curated service. But in 2012, needing to grow, Spotify commissioned a research study on its user base. And according to a source who I interviewed, who was close to the company at the time, the researchers identified about 40 participants in major cities who were tasked with keeping detailed listening diaries and mapping out how they listened to music throughout the day. And this revealed to the company that people were listening to music across a range of moments in their everyday lives. The source told me that at first Spotify really thought they were competing with iTunes. Rather than having the music on your hard drive, it was streaming. But having done the study, they realized active listening was a smaller part of the experience, that more people wanted Spotify to choose things for them as they leaned back. So in some ways, the company started to optimize for that experience. And it's pretty interesting. If this would have been 2012, by the end of that year, Spotify.com, the homepage, really started to change from this more focus on things like instant, simple, and free, to play music now, to looking a little bit more like this early in 2012. And then by the end of 2012, it was really focused on this music for every moment, these sort of moody images that kind of look like they came from a Tumblr or a Pinterest board at the time. So by 2013, the company hired these in-house playlist curators from Tunigo, a Swedish app for ready-made playlists that Spotify had acquired in 2013. And they launched a sort of early playlist strategy based on a broadcast radio model called the Syndicate, which is a kind of hierarchy of major genre playlists and sprawling niche regional feeder playlists, where they would apparently like test songs out and then graduate them up based on data. So at the time in the press, Spotify marketing executives were talking about how their initial growth was with music enthusiasts, but the Music for Every Moment campaign was going to be their way of reaching a mass mainstream audience by reaching users on an emotional level. To turn profits, Spotify needed to grow its user base, and organizing music by mood was going to be part of attracting them. So this wasn't an entirely new concept. In the book, I sort of try to trace the history of this a bit, looking into how organizing music by mood was something that had been done for almost 100 years, if not longer, when Spotify launched its mood playlist ecosystem. In 1921, the Thomas Edison company released a catalog called Mood Music, where they organized their diamond discs according to different moods that could try to help contextualize their records for people who maybe didn't know what they wanted to listen to. And they distributed mood change charts where they asked customers to listen to their records and chart how their mood had changed. And hilariously, one page, perhaps relevant to our conversation here today, in this mood music catalog from 1921 is this image of this man who is having a bad day due to a jolt in the market and then becomes steadied by music. But it's pretty interesting to look at. A lot of the ways in which music is organized by mood in this catalog are pretty similar to the types of mood categories that still exist on a service like Spotify today. So in the book that I published, I try to look at some of the bigger impacts of playlistification on music, and of the multiple investigations in the book. Definitely one is this investigation into the rise of what I refer to in the book as ghost artists, but what in the music press over the years have been called fake artists. Spotify's practice of, filling up its lean back mood playlists with stock music by artists who don't exist. The artist names are artists who don't exist, but the musicians are very much real. And this was definitely something that I was thinking of while reading both derivative media and while reading Andrew's book. I think that in some ways the process of making this sort of, it's what the public has known as fake artist music, but what internally at Spotify they call perfect fit content, from my perspective, is such an interesting example of like deeply derivative practice within music. I had a chance to interview a couple of musicians who had been commissioned by these stock music agencies who have special contracts with Spotify to fill up these playlists at reduced royalty rates. And they would say things in interviews directly like, the process of making perfect fit content starts with studying, making new PFC starts with studying old PFC, a feedback loop of playlist fodder imitated over and over again. Another one said, that they would get sent a playlist at the beginning of the month of tracks that had been successful within the sort of broader PFC universe, and then asked to basically generate tracks that matched the ones that had already been successful. So you were then to compose however many tracks you and Epidemic agree on, drawing inspiration from said playlist. And, musicians would tell me things like, I did it because I needed a job and the money was better than any money I could make from even successful indie labels, many of which I worked with. This has been another area of the music business that's been subject to this process of financialization in recent years, with companies like Epidemic Sound, one of the suppliers of this ghost artist content, at a over $1.4 billion valuation. And Blackstone growth executives, one of the companies invested in this content, saying things like, this at the end of the day is a data business, something that surely a lot of people in music would disagree with. And that's about 9 minutes, so I will leave it there for now. Hopefully that was not too much information.
Thank you, Liz. Should I hop in? Yeah, okay. I got some slides as well, and I will also set a timer. Okay, so let me just set the timer. All right, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks, Liz. I'm going to show a silly amount of slides in 8 minutes, which is normally a bad idea, but I'll include the link to the slides in the chat as well. And in part, this is because I imagine we have some educators, instructors in the audience, and that maybe these are helpful to include. It's always hard to get information about media consolidation and things. So you're welcome to use those however you see fit. It's an open access book. Please use it however you like. All right. I also want to have this overview of the empirical data because that's a big part of the project. So, the book here, I'll use the quick description, shows how the financial sector is dismantling the creative capacity of cultural industries by upwardly redistributing wealth, consolidating corporate media, harming creative labor, and restricting our collective media culture. And again, it's open access if you want, or you can buy a copy. There's two main sections, the effect of finance on media industries, as well as the effect of finance on media texts. I'm going to focus on that first part today. So here, the broadest, quickest overview of the political economy of the US. GDP growth rates, down. Rate of profit, down. Investment and savings in the US private sector, down. Tax rates for the wealthy, down. Tax haven usage, way up. Access to cheap credit. You can see the time period of what we're talking about. The rise of streaming media happens when there are 0% interest rates. That causes a huge amount of debt all across the economy, including with media companies. We have tremendous income inequality and wealth inequality, of course, but it's good to look historically that this was not always the case. Here's wealth. Labor share of income continues to decline. Here we can see the decline of unions is pretty closely correlated with wages, even though productivity continues to go up. We see a lot more spending on lobbying. That includes big media companies, trade organizations who are lobbying to get their desired outcomes, particularly with copyright. Here's big media, here's big music, spending a lot to enforce copyright. Big tech companies used to stay away from this, but have gone very intensely on lobbying recently. And so this is the long downturn. This is capitalism unable to produce growth anymore. One of the key effects is the rise of financial capital. You can't make things through production anymore, so you financially engineer things for profit instead. Here with the green line, we see the rise of financial assets. Blue is profits ticking up from 5% to over 25%. Here's global financial assets. The blue one is non-bank financial institutions, or sometimes alternative investments. The things I'm going to talk about, hedge funds, private equity, asset managers, things that aren't traditional banks have gotten huge. And that's worthwhile to look historically, right? The stock market used to be, most stocks were held by households, individuals, over 80, 90%. That is no longer the case. It is institutional investors and asset managers. The stock market is an inequality machine. We can see here the top 1% have over half. Bump it up to the top 10%, and it's almost the whole stock market. Not nearly the machine for spreading wealth as it was originally designed. Here we have the number of firms just slowly going down. Meanwhile, market capitalization going up. Good depiction of consolidation. Here we have the number of mergers and acquisitions exploding over the last 20 years. That includes tech companies, over 1,000 for the big five, but even more for the biggest media companies, just continually buying out, acquiring their competitors. They're constantly buying dividends. Or sorry, they're not buying dividends. They're putting out dividends. Stock market, again, this goes back to the wealthiest people in the stock market, but media companies have moved towards rewarding their shareholders rather than reinvesting. So here's a dividend, distribution of profits. Stock buyback is when they buy back their own stock to make that stock price higher. We see that really rising over the last 20 years, but that particularly in media companies, it's become really pronounced. That's billions of dollars that could have been spent on musicians or reinvested. Here cumulatively, it's over $300 billion, right? Imagine how many musicians that could have paid a living wage to. Here's CEO compensation to worker ratio, just exploded. Someone like is it right? Michael Rapino, the guy who runs Live Nation, just an insane like $300 million. That ratio is just so different than it used to be, right? Those used to be held in check. Here's executive compensation at media companies over the last little while, really exploding recently. Those guys tend to look a little something like this. Asset managers is another big aspect of financialization. They are managing mutual funds, pension funds, endowments, etc. They are increasingly just a huge chunk of how the stock market operates. That includes things like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, who we see involved, BlackRock particularly in music, different from Blackstone, a private equity company, which I'll get to. But here we can see media companies just slowly being taken over by these asset managers. Then we have private equity, which is a little different, right? That's when they raise money to buy out a company, streamline it. Often it ends up bankrupt or a shell of its former self. And there's a tremendous amount of money going into this. They use methods like dividends, laying off high-wage labor, lots of like engineering tactics. They're not actually producing things. They are going in and out of bankruptcy for the tax savings, things like that. Here's a list of all the companies that have done it, and you'll see in 2004 a lot of music ones, right? And the Warner Music Group, Concord, Cumulus, it really takes off around this era. Yeah, lately it's been more like, Blackstone taking over hypnosis, things like that. But it's been really prominent in music. I'll leave these shadow studios. That's more of a Hollywood thing. Our next one is the rise of hedge funds, which is more of a traditional investment rather than private equity buys out the whole company, hedge funds making like super quick trades. But an interesting part is hedge fund activists who pressure companies to increase cash flow and extract that cash flow. They're trying to get those dividends and buybacks, and they'll empty out a company by doing that. AT&T and Warner was a good example of that recently. But we can see here the hedge fund trading just exploding recently. Venture capital is another sort of tool of financialization that I look at, and lesser known is corporate venture capital. So these huge media companies have their own division for venture capital, often making more money than the company itself. Here's a list of all the media companies, their VC divisions. So you see something like, Universal Music Group has 32. Sony has like a lot. Other, Odyssey, iHeartMedia, Liberty, lots of music companies who are in the venture capital world. And we have derivatives, complicated financial instruments, but important to understanding how speculative capital works. But also for my book, I sort of pun on like, the content is becoming more derivative, in part because it's treated like a derivative, a financial instrument for speculation. The derivatives market is insane. Here we have 600 trillion compared to actual world GDP being like 100. It's this layer on top of the real economy. Here we see media and tech companies involved in derivatives trading. And then finally, I'm at 9 minutes already. Finance fuels monopoly. I'll just show here's like the music consolidation, right? Universal, Sony, Warner. This looks like wallpaper. It's just static. Music publishing has a few more, but really is the same. Here we can charts for seeing format changes. This historical stuff is really helpful in classrooms, I find. Here it is globally. Here's the distribution of revenue from a streaming music platform, knowing that so much of it goes right back out to labels. Concert ticket prices. Students really want to talk about Taylor Swift tickets, right? This is a good one to help see about how they're way above consumer price index, and that the inequality in the music industry is perhaps best seen here, where the top 1% used to only have about 30% of the market, now like 60%. Everyone out, the 95% left with very little. So I can talk more about the effect of finance on media text if you'd like later, or you can check out the book, but thank you very much.
Okay, thanks both. That was great. to hear and see those images. Elena or Alyx, I may show some slides at the end if you could make me a co-host perhaps as I talk. And if there's time, I'll show a few images. I feel slide envy now. So if I have time, I'll show a couple. But we'll see. I'll just spend most of my time, I think, talking about a few concepts that help me think about how to study satellite radio. And this is a book, Music in Orbit, about music and culture at the turn of the new millennium. As you know, these three books together largely focus on this time, but capturing sort of a time when certain aspects of music culture become increasingly centralized and given further significance, legacy, and value, like the catalogs of the Beatles and Elvis, for instance. I begin by talking about those big compilation albums that hit the top of the Billboard charts by both those artists. And they're two of the more significant artists to have Sirius XM channels. But other aspects become increasingly fragmented, niche, weird, personal, like online music communities and you know, the move to more individual ways of listening. And of course, as we just saw, it's a time when concentration in the radio and record industry and then in big tech accelerates and alters the way we hear music. And changing the way we pay for music, don't pay for music, thinking through the value of music. And over this transition, a media company that has been less frequently discussed is Sirius XM. And part of my interest in this story is that very fact. This now kind of monopoly, the company that operates a monopoly in the satellite radio market and is formerly distinct companies of XM and Sirius have anticipated many of the cultural, musical, and technological shifts that now define our moment. They began by demonstrating that they would offer music or programming that was kind of radio beyond radio, kind of like cable television. But now the merged company under Liberty Media stands as one of a few big, massive companies that operate in this internet streaming online audio nexus. So I'm going to talk about three concepts and then maybe show some images. And these concepts are orbits, perceived value, and the targeting of listeners. So for orbits, I use the orbital path of satellites in the book as a metaphor for thinking through the cycles of music consumption, as well as the routines and rotations of everyday life that radio really facilitates. You know, songs are released and they circulate, some widely and with resonance, while others with little staying power or without the result of finding the right audience at the right time. Music from the past returns to the present, a fact that becomes really evident around the 2000s. You have folks like Amanda Mull writing in The Atlantic at the end of the 2010s saying that it's hard to look back at the past 20 years and argue convincingly that whatever is happening now hadn't already started in the early 2000s. As time moves forward, the gap between past trends and cultural products that come back into style in the present has shrunk, or, you know, commentators have pointed to that. Some have said that the nostalgia loop has sped up. And these statements in the popular press obviously echo a lot of academic debates and discussions through the 80s and 90s about, you know, postmodernism, pastiche, you know, thinking through the work of Frederick Jameson and Linda Hutchin and others. And we can think of our own taste and preferences in music as having certain songs, artists, or albums that exist in our own orbit. They serve as references for our own interests in music and our own identities and sense of ourselves. Orbits also reflect, you know, the sort of material cycles of music. You know, we cycle through playlists, often returning to the beginning when we hit the end. The music we grow up with might track us down later in meaningful ways. Of course, CDs and albums cycle too. And radio relates to these cycles, encouraging a sense of dailiness. This is something, obviously, media scholar Patty Scannell has argued to be essential to our understanding of what makes radio radio. For perceived value, you know, thinking about this moment of having access to so many things all at once, asking the question about what gives music value or a sense of value when we have this expanded range of choice, especially when music is sort of cyclical, thinking of these rotations. Some songs are lost forever, just as some satellites circle the planet as space junk. They're still out there, but without much use or relevance. The satellite radio industry plays a role in crafting this perceived value of music and things like programming decisions, radio voices, promotional models employed by the sort of synergies between radio and the record industry. So you have these big institutions introducing new music, sharing new music from the past, pairing, pop-up channels with films that are coming out, or artists who have just passed away, or artists who have new albums out. So these key intermediaries working to keep music in circulation, something that becomes a set of questions and issues when there's so few major record companies or big companies like Sirius and XM or Spotify or Apple that guide us to certain songs at certain moments. The third is this concept of targeting. This really focuses in on the technology of the satellite. Satellite radio has been a key component in the intertwining stories of niche and subscription listening, the siloing and targeting of taste and listening habits, and sort of idealized listening context of the streaming era. Simultaneously, it gives a feeling of collective connection, this long-standing domain of radio, but of also hyper-personalization. So it's a radio service that's a precursor to our current moment, where a few large music services are used by lots of people for their own personalized music selections. The dichotomy of centralization and fragmentation was really apparent in 2014 in an interview with President and Chief Content Officer of SiriusXM, Scott Greenstein, which posed this question: how do you measure its value? In other words, how do you measure its success on subscription radio without advertising and ratings? Or how do you measure its value, in other words? His answer was that you look to subscriber numbers and growth. And what drives these numbers, according to Greenstein, is the availability of niche music channels and then the availability of the current big successful songs, which increasingly are gleaned from things like YouTube sourcing of data based on the platform's biggest music videos, but other modes, of course, too. So another important concept for understanding the history of satellite radio is that of targeting or hyper-targeting listeners. The cultural technology of the satellite is one that targets, as does the music companies that use listener data to shape playlists, algorithms, and channels. The satellite, of course, is also a tool of military surveillance, as well as one of delivering niche music channels to distinct user profiles. And as such, it's a central figure in the platformization of music, where media platforms mediate the circulation of commodities. And I'll show a couple images, I think. I actually haven't shared a screen in years. Is this working? Okay. So this one, I thought, this is an old ad for Sirius back in the day. And it, I think, is a good example of that targeting. All these small rural towns will now give you 100 radio stations, even if you have one traffic light. These aren't as sophisticated as Liz and Andrew's slides, but we have these old sort of annual report images with Pontiac Sunfires and trucks driving, doing shipping work, giving a sense of like, this is something that can keep your listening, your preferences, your personalized tastes with you at all times. And here somebody's listening to U2's New Year Day. Thinking too about that idea of orbit, or the idea that something was out there kind of dropping down music from the sky. This was a service that went really all in on genres like EDM and hip hop kind of before there was a lot of presence of that on commercial radio. There's also a company that used that term stream a lot. Well, before streaming, they referred to their channels as streams: rock streams, dance streams, jazz streams. And then this kind of fragmentation of formats, they would call it like super serving formats, is now a little bit slicker with things like your artist-based channels, where you have these big personalities, figures, some alive, some dead, that serve to kind of draw people in and to get them to subscribe, not unlike getting a contract with Joe Rogan, Spotify, to try to drive listeners to that platform. They really set the model for that in place. So I'll leave it there. I think I'm also around 9 minutes, and we can move to some questions.
Do we get to ask each other questions at this point? All right.
Yeah.
I'll happily start if we can. I got about a
Sure.
dozen. My first is maybe, yeah, the broadest kind of way for us to think about how these books relate. So as a trio, these books each take a slightly different approach. But what I like is that I feel like we are all actually trying to talk about a whole of some sort as opposed to just something particular. And so Liz, yours is maybe most like on the ground, how Spotify works, how it affects musicians and listeners, gives us a perspective on the music industry as a whole from below, it feels. Brian's is a little more mid-level, focused on a company too, but also governmental regulation, transnational expansion, value space. And then mine is maybe a little more macro, broad historical, political economy, but still like interested in the effect on art and labor. And so, yeah, again, unlike most books, maybe on music, we want to try to get a sense of the whole, but that's really difficult and a sort of impossible task. Um, but we sort of, yeah, we try that from different vantage points. So I was wondering if you two want to talk about what was the whole that you conceived of? What were you trying to grasp? Knowing that like in the process of writing a book, you inevitably have to be like, well, I wish I could talk about that too, but I have to like cut things off and focus on something. So yeah, what is the whole you conceived of? How you thought you could make sense of it, and maybe how that whole changed over the course of writing the book. Did things evolve? Yeah, I'll open it up.
I can begin, I guess. I think it's a good question. I think part of the challenge that I was working through was how to chart what this company was doing or what satellite radio was doing without just and only focusing on the company or satellite radio and trying to expand the scope a little bit at least to engage with things like the way a company might negotiate with the copyright review board to determine how they pay royalties, or how we might think through the move from a company imagining themselves competing with commercial radio and trying to tease out more experimental ways art of organizing music programming to then competing with your Spotify's and Apple Music's and trying to catch up and also to tell the story of how and why some companies have survived the last few decades when we've seen so many fall and to try to like expand outwards enough to be in conversation with what was happening at an industry level, but to I guess think as well about where to stop, right? Like I didn't go too far into the ins and outs and everything about what a satellite is and a little bit of that detail, but not so far or um, you know the more macro level, keeping it like you say at sort of the medium range. So I think part of it was trying to tell this story while also engaging with broader debates and discussions in music culture that were taking place, at least and particularly in a North American context at that time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question to think about, like the whole, because I think the way that in which I think about my book is more of as an entryway. I think of it much more as sort of an attempt to take some really uh, complicated ideas and make them as accessible as possible. Like you mentioned, it is sort of a ground level story. And that's really how I think about it too. Like I've described it a bunch, trying to tell a ground up story by thinking about, obviously thinking about this company, but also thinking about the impact that it has had on listeners and artists by talking to those musicians, talking to people who have experienced like the impacts. Um, but yeah, I guess if there's any hole I was trying to understand, it's really just sort of like, I guess, the two-sided marketplace that Spotify talks about and kind of, trying to understand this one company as much as possible as a sort of way of hopefully bringing people into as I often say, like a story that neither starts nor ends with one single company.
Well, it kind of felt like just a story about capitalism as well, in that like we encounter that same thing in different ways, the flattening, the alienation, all these different things. It felt like a really grounded story that could be other companies as well. But it's just such a fantastic book. So thank you. I
How about you?
have more, but I'll let someone else ask a
Do you
question.
want to talk about your macro level though, and at
Uh,
least round it out?
I feel like you saw it there. My top-down view is like how much empirical data can I get to show things. Ironically, I wrote this was my dissertation without any of that, and then pretty close to the book being finished, I still didn't have a lot of that, and I got access to this insane financial analysis software that usually costs $20,000 a month, but our library had access to it. So I could grab all this stuff and actually illustrate it with these visualizations. Mostly it was a process of encountering some weird financial thing. At first, it was private equity. Like, what is that? How does it work? Where are the examples? And that's the only one that really shows up in the earliest draft. And then I'm like, oh, hedge funds, I'll have to add that. And then asset managers are maybe the most recent phenomena that have come to be so pronounced. And so it's just like following it until it felt like I was building a pretty big macro level. Yeah. Can I follow up? Yeah, sorry, let's go ahead.
Yeah, so I have like a question for each of you, but they're different questions. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to ask you guys the same question, but something that I would, so maybe just start with Andrew, like a question that I would love to get your sort of like conversational answer to is, could you explain from your perspective the difference between what you feel like consolidation does to culture versus what financialization does to culture? And I know that's kind of like what your whole book is about, but it would be great to just sort of like hear your summary of that.
Yeah. Are you going to ask Brian his question so that it gives me a minute to think about that? Such
Well,
a good question.
the question that I have for Brian is specifically about subscription. Like, I would love to get your thoughts on how you think the mechanism of subscription as a way that people pay for culture changes how we think of what music is for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Do you want me to respond, Andrew, while you do that, or do you want to do yours first?
If you want to jump into yours, please do.
Yeah, I think I could just be quick, probably. I think that, I mean, it's interesting because it feels like, and this is a question I sort of have for both of you that we can save for later, perhaps, just like where to stop when you're looking at a company or a phenomena like this. And I feel like now we're really in a moment of people reevaluating and taking stock of how many subscriptions one has, right? It's not just music or film or TV, it's food being delivered to your house, or the way that different memberships or subscriptions work across a wide variety of things like Adobe. All sorts of things we do now are subscription based, and it costs a lot. So I think in some cases people don't think. I think there's, like, as with popular music consumption and thinking about different ideas of value and cultural hierarchies, I think there's probably lots of people that think first and foremost about access and convenience, and making sure that you're paying something to get what you want without too many disruptions, advertisements and things like that. And I think other forms of subscription, like at least in SiriusXM's initial model, was you'll pay a little more and you won't have to do any work, and we'll kind of give you what you're after with people making choices for you. And you won't have to be the one building. I mean, a lot of services have moved more to a way to encourage that sort of hang back and let the music play. But there's definitely less work for a listener with something like SiriusXM, because you have channels on, at least some of the channels, a DJ or somebody playing music, and you can just drive or do whatever you're doing. So I think that in those cases, people might be thinking about what does this subscription give me, and am I content with everything it has? Higher at a higher level too. Sometimes it could be about that question around exclusivity, and if I'm listening to a certain podcast or a certain artist, and there's more of that material available somewhere, you might go there, right? So I think it's kind of become something where it shapes your points of reference and the cultural touchstones you have, based on what you're being given. And that might be a particular algorithm pushing a certain type of music, or having your top 5 or 6 channels you sort of cycle through. But I'm really curious right now about the future of this, at a time when the cost of living has gone up, and I think a lot of people are thinking through, how many of these subscriptions can I manage? And the flip side of that is how impossible now it is to get out of any of these subscriptions.
Thanks again for the great question, Liz. It's a tricky one, right? And I sometimes have not necessarily cleared that up. And so they're both separate phenomenon, but they are sort of gears that work together, financialization and consolidation. I think we would say we haven't, or consolidation in the music industry has always been there, to varying degrees. Whereas financialization is something that has really accelerated recently, and thus is a phenomenon that we are not as used to in understanding, maybe. And then financialization as specifically financial instruments that get used to speculate, that get used to extract, that are risk-based, and that those aren't necessarily at all related to consolidation. Like, if the big companies that are trying to, like, quote unquote build a moat around their industry, they don't want risk, they don't want to speculate, and they certainly don't want extraction in the sense that financial companies do, where they prey on a company, right? The private equity buys it, extracts what it can, either sells it off, does an IPO, or lets it go bankrupt. Doesn't matter to them. It's about getting their fees. Whereas that's not, obviously not a long-term business. And in fact, private equity are always 5 to 10 year like investment funds, where they have to be finished by then. So there's an even shorter term profit model for finance that there isn't with consolidated media. They're still motivated by quarterly reports. They have to continually produce shareholder value, but they do so in a way that makes them a long-term investment as opposed to finance, which is really kind of openly destructive in a way that media companies have not been in the past. I would say that's a big part of it. And then another would be that financialization can be thought of as like consolidating the market economy itself, that it is removing competition. And I mean, consolidation does too, but generally within a sector, not in the way asset managers are, take 10, 15, 20% of companies in every sector. So I think those are some important distinctions. And then my last thing would be, like, I would say a financialized media economy is far more likely to produce slop, as we call it now, than a consolidated media company. A consolidated media company still has a relationship to an audience in a different way, or has in the past, than now. If it is just something you're trying to assetize, it doesn't, the quality of that content is like, you're far more removed from it than in the past. Maybe Brian, do you have a question?
No, I was just going to say that I think I was pinged, and we have some questions in the chat. And if we're cool, I know I have so many questions, but I know it's 3:52 as well. So maybe Alyx, if you want to circulate some questions, is that how the next little bit should work?
Sure. Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat. And the first one is actually an observation from Robin James about Vibe.
Sorry, I was just saying it was also 2013 that Vibe started being used as a word for a person and not just a place. So it's really interesting that 2013 is the year we get the playlist on Spotify. And this is also happening. So just interesting coincidence.
All right. And then Carl, you have a few different ideas kind of percolating in the chat. Do you want to start with your like sort of the question that you just posed?
I'm sure. I feel like I'm jumping the queue a little bit, but the other things were just stray comments that weren't meant to be questions at all. But I'll ask anyway. So this is mainly for Liz, but I think it's relevant to everybody's stuff, so comment as you will. But I feel like I'm dubious of the argument that streaming creates a much more drastically passive listening culture than existed in the past. Just because it seems to me that using music as background and mood facilitation has always been a major, if not dominant, part of mass media um, since it began. Radio station formats from high energy to easy listening to quiet storm, and people change stations depending on their mood, and stations change programming depending on the time of day. And then you have consumer products like multi-disc players or shuffle on iPods. And satellite radio is interesting as a kind of indication of use as the technology expands more and more, we sort of playlistify the ability to do it, and that seems driven by the relationship that people actually have to music on a day-to-day level and what they're looking for from music, rather than sort of a top-down thing that's being forced on them by the corporate entity. Obviously, I see that it syncs well with money-making desires, but I think we as music aficionados, we tend to overestimate the degree to which people are active seeking listeners as opposed to people who are trying to find things to use music in an everyday way. And so I'd love to hear you all talk about what makes it a difference in kind rather than just a difference in degree as technology expands.
Mhm. It's so interesting. Sorry, this is like one specific thing, the idea of music aficionados overestimating the average listener, where I think so much in terms of the industry underestimating the average listener and like deeply like underestimating what the average listener, whatever that is, the relationship that humans are capable of having with music is so deeply underestimated by the music business. But yeah, I think, those are all really interesting points. Music is so vast and there's so many different reasons why people come to it. And surely streaming services and did not invent the concept of the lean back listener. I think like radio is a great prehistory of understanding passive listening. And in the book, I trace like different examples of prehistories of music as mood stabilization, functional music, not trying to suggest that streaming invented this way of listening to music, but I do think it has been really central to the business model. And I think that's what I'm trying to outline. I try to really distinctly in the book say that I think the criticisms that are being made of streaming are as much about what's changed as they are about what's stayed the same. And streaming, was pitched as shiny and new, as disruptive technology, but actually a lot of the things that tech entrepreneurs pitch as shiny and new are actually repackaged versions of pre-existing products, pre-existing industry practices. And I think that that is as much, worth acknowledging and unpacking as what's new about streaming. I do think that like the question of like what is truly new about the current era of passive listening being pushed on listeners is, the sheer amount of data collection that informs the way in which users are recommended music and the way in which music is shaped. But yeah, no, I think it's important to keep in mind like all of those prehistories that contextualize this current era of passive listening.
Yeah, I think one thing I would just quickly say, it's sort of interesting to see how over the course of sort of studying this, how different ideas of, more kind of active engaged listening versus more of a passive listening have functioned in the overall organization of programming on satellite radio, whereas you used to have more, DJ focused or radio host focused programs like in those sweet spots of like channels 1 to 20, and some of those are getting like booted down into the 70s now. And you're getting more like the coffee shop channel and TikTok's channel, and these sort of non-hosted music playlists are in those higher spots, kind of thinking about generational shifts in listening. Not that the voice is totally gone, but some of those new voices are more of your sort of podcast debating, arguing style way of talking, and less of the, authoritative voice telling you about music that's kind of getting pushed down with some of the older generation, so to speak, up higher in the numbers.
I'll just briefly say about the, less possibility for active listening potentially, in the sense that the network to support more musicians who make a sustainable livelihood weakens. But there hasn't been a replacement for alt weeklies and music criticism and all the things that supported it, being replaced by TikTok and Spotify. I'll just leave it at that.
And I guess one other, sorry, like, don't need to elaborate on it very much, but I do also think that it's important to remember that like streaming services are pitched not as just like media, not just as like, something to replace radio, but also to the record store and the marketplace within which like artists are supposed to monetize their work and make their livelihoods. And I think that sort of like changes the consequences as well.
Thanks a lot.
Steve Jones. Oh, sorry, Carl. Steve Jones had a question about sort of points of comparison between the development of satellite radio in the US and the development of digital audio broadcasting in Europe.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, as far as I looked into those comparisons, part of it was some of the early examples of attempts to deliver music by subscription or satellite were in Europe, and different options where you could use your phone to order an album or a song that would get sent to your television or that sort of thing. You have, in terms of the style of radio that Sirius and XM are delivering, the big other example is World Space, which was first, and covered a lot of countries in Africa and Asia, and I think some European countries perhaps too. And it filed for bankruptcy in 2008. But I think where the DAB and the satellite radio comparisons are sharper are in the emphasis on trying to deliver higher quality audio, especially in the space of the vehicle, and treating the car as this personal, individualized place where music can potentially sound good. And there's a lot of debate around how good satellite radio actually sounds, especially as bandwidth increases. Something I've noticed with the Canadian channels here in Canada, which were introduced as part of a content regulation, they don't sound good. It's almost like this gestural thing. We'll give you these channels, but they're not going to have the fidelity of our classic rock channel or our 70s channel or that sort of thing. But I think both of these examples were moves to try to emphasize a different type of radio, and one point of comparison would be that early emphasis on sound quality. Something that Sirius XM is kind of abandoned in a lot of its marketing now. It's less focused on that, but I think that's where I would go. And in order to keep it short, I think I'll leave it at that point of comparison, but a great question.
Next up, we have Eric Harvey, who has a question about how economic and technological assemblages imprint onto media texts.
Yeah, so I can just kind of maybe quickly condense that verbiage there. But one thing I did know, I haven't gotten as deep into Brian's book. It just came today, so that's my excuse. But even in the introduction, I could see you kind of talking about sort of how this pre-millennial indie rock space, lots of music was kind of themed to outer space and to kind of satellite-y things, and obviously Andrew wrote a couple chapters about how sort of this derivative media and the media economy of the U.S. is sort of producing, individual lyrics kind of are financial instruments and words. And of course, Liz, in your book, talk about, music is mood, but, mood music that we think about from the 50s, Mantovani, this is not the kind of mood music that we're thinking about today, but, it feels I think a similar function. I don't know if any of this is able to be talked about, within our time at this point, but just a connection I saw that I thought was super interesting.
I could jump in to give my super quick version of that, which is, I show, here's my charts,
Nice.
hip hop lyrics as like branded transactions, and that you see supply and demand happening through their sort of different periods in rap history, through liquor brands and automobiles. You can see like when the financial crisis happens that branded transactions change, drop off, and then come back. But yeah, these I would say lyrics are for sale, and more than that, securitized, financialized. You can make investments. If you are Jay-Z, you want to mention particular things to try to increase the value of a particular asset before you sell it, things like that. So in the book, I go through, reflexive comedies on TV, hip hop lyrics, and then branded blockbusters as well. So those are my examples. But I wanted to then point us back to Liz's book, because she has this really great line: by musacking ambient into utilitarian self-help content, tech companies have contributed to ambient going the way of punk and folk, traditions that started out rooted in philosophies of musical relationships, now flattened to the point that many listeners hear them solely as aesthetics. I thought that was really great. And I was curious, in the book you talk about ambient and chill and stream bait. I was curious if in the intervening time, or there's something new you're seeing being flattened or homogenized, or if you just want to talk about those some more. While Brian, maybe that's, builds on Eric's question, what is being flattened by SiriusXM? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's interesting when I think about that, like flattening and the phenomenon of, ghost artists, the rise of like listening to music according to like mood and vibe buttons instead of according to artists and albums. Like it's definitely, I feel like the risk is, cutting out the role of the artist in the exchange there. And that's something that I think like right now remains a big conversation with generative AI content. And I definitely feel like the next, there's like that section about chill in the book, and then later on there's a section about Endel, and I kind of feel like they could have been the same chapter, but it just structurally didn't work out that way. But yeah, I definitely feel like there's some interesting context that hopefully the conversation around like mood playlists, ghost artist content, like hopefully this is useful for people and having other conversations about the impacts of generative AI now. That's definitely been the biggest thing since the book came out, is way more people have way more questions about AI music.
I think just quickly, in this case, there is that emphasis on the satellite as a marker of something like unique or kind of extra in music at that particular time. And now, of course, outer space is, thrown around for all sorts of things, right? That's where everybody's going to go if Elon Musk has his way. And I think beyond that, though, one thing that really factors into the programming approach of SiriusXM, and it's something that's kind of lessened and become more of a gesture across time, is using like distinct eras and their technologies to craft channels, like to have, a cassette era, popular music, vinyl based era, blogs, all of these like kind of ways of thinking through the past that kind of flatten what an actual era's music or experience would have been, to try to tap into keeping subscribers with different musical tastes across different generations and years kind of in place and intact.
Next up, Elena has a question about methods.
Should I seed? I think I should seed my question to the audience, and then if
Okay.
there's time in the end, I'll
Yeah.
do.
Good. We've got two more, and then I can cycle back to you. So Liz Shabilsky has a question about sort of points of comparison between individual and group listening in these contexts.
Okay, sorry, I'm not able to get my video to work. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, so I was curious, building off a previous question about maybe the differences, is it there's a difference in kind or degree compared to previous eras of mood listening? And I'm wondering how the intense individuation that the data collection on streaming platforms allows, the role that that might play in how you are all conceptualizing this. And then perhaps if you could speak with us a little bit about the role of group listening, if you think there continues to be a role of group listening as you've seen these shifts in technologies that you've been following here.
Can you clarify what you mean by group listening?
Yeah, I guess I mean something like if we're listening to Sirius XM, everybody in the same area that is served by that satellite will get the same content. Whereas if I am at my own house listening to Spotify, I can get my personal playlist and someone else in my house can get a really different personal playlist because we have data on each of us.
Mm. Yeah, that's super interesting. The first thing that comes to mind is, I have like a section in my book where I talk about the AI DJ product on Spotify, which is basically just like a automated, it's like a button that you can press on the Spotify app, and it presents you with a series of automated personalized blocks of song recommendations with the generative AI voice spliced in between them. And the thing that I write in the book is that that voice is always sort of telling you about where the block of songs that's about to play fits into your taste profile. It's not telling you information about, where this block of tracks connects to music culture, or really telling you anything about like the artist or the label or the tradition or the history. It's like, these are some songs you listened to in 2022. You're going to hear yourself in this. And it's just sort of like, completely, from my perspective, not the point of what radio is. Like, it's not, at least from my perspective, I don't think it's like why it's interesting, like, Spotify introducing a product like this at a time where I think that exhausted by personalization and streaming algorithms, a lot of independent music fans have turned to internet radio and stuff like NTS and like the Lot Radio and sort of like online radio stations that do offer a sense of like group listening, like what you're saying. I think that's like a feeling that people, I mean, I can't claim to know why people like NTS so much, but I think that it might be like because of what you just described. You have a sense that you're listening to something at the same time as a lot of other people. I think of like WFMU and their chat, which I think of as like it's like a digital public space on the internet, is like the WFMU chat room that is on the side. And Lot Radio has this too, based in New York, like a chat where people are talking while they're listening to the live stream as well. Just so different from the hyper personalization and complete like lack of a group experience that you would get from listening to a hyper personalized AI DJ stream on Spotify, which is, in the book I sort of contextualize as sort of the result of a kind of a goal that Spotify had been after for a long time, and its corporate strategy of wanting to deliver the user like one button that they could press for a stream of self-driving music that self-organizes around your listening behavior, and kind of like day list is like the Gen Z vibes based targeting of this goal, whereas AI DJ was more targeted towards like older listeners who quote unquote like are more comfortable with radio metaphors. Anyway, so it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I think just quickly, one other aspect of group listening. I mean, SiriusXM still does a lot of like call-ins, and especially on like, the Beatles channel, I have like some kind of Beatles experts taking calls from kids and fans and all that sort of stuff. But one thing I wanted to bring in too is thinking about that framing of group listening and like related research. Some of the research that Andrew and myself and Brianne Selman have done on musician like labor is a lot of musicians now talk about SiriusXM as being like the biggest amount of royalties they get. Because of that group listening, I guess, thinking about the way there's royalties and one play is going to technically so many people. So for a lot of like independent musicians in Canada, that has been like their biggest royalty statement by far. And talking about, playing in venues and not thinking so much about is the record label person in the room, but is the SiriusXM like programmer in the room, just due to the lucrative nature of those plays.
We can. I don't have much to
add. So our next question is from Alexandria Arietta, who is asking specifically for Liz and Andrew to talk about alternative models of music monetization.
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been super interesting. I would love to hear more about that, alternative models of monetization. I would love some more clarity, Andrew, specifically about like the rising independent sector and how that works and exists in relation to industry consolidation. And then just insight about paths for musicians moving forward in the future.
Actually listen to. There's the vast majority of the royalties back to the major rights holders, so Sony, Universal, and Warner. And there's also the Living Wage for Musicians Act, which is this is a United States rooted perspective, but ideas of new royalty systems that would go around the rights holders entirely and like pay royalty. Alternatively, you'll have like things like the Bandcamp model, like people paying artists directly for digital downloads is something that has become like a popular way of think of at least 5 different ones off the top of my head that are all, I think, worth looking into.
Yeah, I will build off Liz here. Certainly the opportunities for reform are like there. Yeah, it's possible we could do antitrust reform, like break up these big companies, I think is more manageable than creating a new model within the same economy. Like it'll just, as I mentioned, with like corporate venture capital, they'll just buy out the next Bandcamp or whatever, unless we create something against those very means. It is not profit driven. So yeah, antitrust reform could break up a bunch of companies. I talk about financial reform would actually have a huge impact on culture, on music, on film and TV. So financial reform that, private equity and hedge funds, for instance, these are relatively new phenomenon. They don't need to exist. They are actually very destructive. They probably shouldn't exist. Those could be regulated. Tax reform would have a huge effect. That's one. other, you mentioned like the rising independent sector. I'm not sure that it is rising. I mean, certainly there are more people making music than ever before. I don't know that that independent and Spotify will say that it is, but I don't know that I believe that at all. And my understanding of these enormous financial companies or media companies or tech companies is that they have very much consolidated and they leave a little bit of room for independent musicians and labels so that they breed the next new artist that they can sign. So I don't know what I would say about that. I would say like monetization. I've used that phrase before as well, but like maybe let's get away from using that, and that's not really the aim. The aim is like a sustainable livelihood for musicians. What does that take? As Liz mentioned, there is a policy designed specifically for that. That makes more sense to me. Liz and Brian and I all also talk about libraries as a really interesting model. Much better than a shopping mall. Let's use the library as how we think about how culture should be circulated. And there's a lot of great labels and musicians and librarians working together to circulate that way. And then I would say, yeah, the biggest one is like getting out of the world of wage labor altogether. And maybe we need to rethink capitalist imperatives altogether. If the long downturn suggests that it will just continue to get worse and worse, I don't know what is still viable within somewhere where growth rates just only go down. But music is a great culture or place where we can think about alternatives because there is so much money there. It could be producing a living wage for so many people, and yet we're allowing it to go to Bill Ackman, some hedge fund jerk, or to these various ghouls making millions and billions. Meanwhile, so many musicians struggle. So even just like redistribution within music is a huge opportunity that allows a lot of people to learn about like what does inequality and redistribution look like. Yeah.
Last question, Elena, do you want to take on the methods question?
Sure. I have a connection that's kind of unstable, so hopefully I will be able to ask it verbally. Hello? Okay. I'm curious about the choices of reporting and research methods for the three books, especially because all three of you guys are confronting, maybe Brian not to the same extent, but you're confronting an enemy. Like you're critiquing your subject, and it's usually makes it more difficult to approach as a research subject. And I know that you all use different methods. Like Liz did a lot of interviews and like journalistic reporting, and Andrew did quantitative analysis and forensic reporting. And I know for Brian, it was difficult to get, like, when you deal with a corporation, it's hard to get corporate information or interviews with a lot of people who may be afraid to share. So how did you guys choose your methods and get around obstacles?
I can go. Oh, no.
Well, I think my best because I'm a journalist and investigative journalism is built on interviews, review of documents and in-person observation. So that was really like the anchor. I knew from the beginning that the anchor of the project was going to be rooted in interviewing. And it was kind of like from there that I then tried to sort of also, bring in deep dive into music press archives, bringing in references to some academic work that has been done around this area, try to make it not just purely journalistic. I also should say that it is what I refer to as, or what's called like reported criticism. So it's journalistic, but it's not purely journalistic. I think the story kind of like from my perspective requires a political perspective as well. I would describe it as pro-artist, but it also could be seen as a critique of a certain relationship between creative labor and capital. But trying to make it as accessible as possible to and readable to a general audience.
Trade press reporting, annual reports, like searching everything that had been written about these companies. Also just lots of listening and even using online archives to track down programs that existed and to get a sense of people's reaction to them and forums and things like that. It's been just over 10 years kind of looking into that stuff, and lots of material from different social media sites to at least check that against the more corporate or the reporting in the trade press. I was able to get a few interviews. A lot of it was people enthusiastically wanting to speak to me and then either disappearing or saying they couldn't, but they probably checked it with a boss or somebody and weren't able to. But I did get a full tour of the studios in DC and a long interview with somebody there who maybe just didn't check, and with a few former employees who were totally fine to speak. So that helped to just bring in those other perspectives and to at least just ensure that the story I was telling from the sources I was working with, was kind of checked with something else, right? So it was a bit of a mixed bag for that reason, and very different from researching campus radio, where everybody wanted to talk to you constantly and gave you everything that they had on the station. So it's very different from that initial process with the other book.
Thanks for the question, and I love the characterization of like researching an enemy, which, yeah, absolutely. I think we talk a lot with our students about like following your passion, research what you're passionate about. Like sometimes spite is a really good thing to follow. I have a lot of hatred for these folks, what motivates me. And in fact, I did interview some of these ghouls, and that's what motivated me to do that. I'm like, how do you think about music like that? How is this your worldview, and what kind of impact does it have? So yeah, talking with a few venture capitalists really propelled me in this direction. Also, living in Los Angeles while I did this meant I could access lots of people, but also like events and places where you could see that happening. And yeah, during that zero interest rate period and the financial excess, it was really helpful to see how that was playing out in industry conferences and things. Yeah, I'm trying to, the challenge with like doing political economy is like building this huge map or system, and it's like inherently incomplete. And like, what are you missing? How do you feel confident about generalizing with broad brushstrokes? And just like it takes time, and I felt a little more confident over the course of 10 years of doing this, but still felt, like I was reducing complex phenomena. But I also think like it's useful to do that. Like finance particularly is like the financial sector tries to sound super complicated and full of all these weird acronyms and terms and math and stuff, when really all that's happening is like money is moving from one place to another, and it's all pooling in one place among a certain demographic of people. And like that is a simple story, and you can tell it simply. And I think it should be. I think we should treat finance as like really basic, even though there's really complex math and algorithms undergirding it. It is still at its heart a really basic phenomenon. So that was like the challenge, was sort of like building up confidence in telling that story. And then I write about like we all need critical financial literacy. We need to like understand those terms to a degree to see what's happening, but like you don't need to know the math to see how they're stealing money.
Spite as a motivator seems like a great note to end on. Thanks for this really awesome conversation, Andrew, Brian, and Liz. We will be back on April 1st. Our very own Eric Weisbard will be engaging with three authors who wrote books about three very different songs. Michael Barthel on Party in the USA, Maya Smith on Ne me quitte pas, and Jason Schneider on Hey Joe. So join us then, and good night. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.